Welcome to Lore of the Rings, where we explore the secret paths of Middle-earth and share the stories Tolkien never told. Before we dive in, take a moment to tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from and whether this tale has found you by day or by night. The gates are breaking. Fire rains from the sky. The great ram Grond batters the stone like the heartbeat of some monstrous titan. Towers blaze against the darkness. The horns of Gondor blow their last defiant notes, but they are drowned beneath the roar of 10,000 orcs, the shriek of Nazgul, and the thunder of war engines dragged across the Pelennor fields. Minas Tirith, the White City, the last bastion of hope in the West, stands on the edge of annihilation. And through the smoke, through the chaos of shattered stone and splintered shields, a figure emerges. Not a king, not a wraith lord crowned in shadow, not even one of the great Nazgul whose terror freezes the blood of mortal men. This is something else. Something whose name is whispered with dread by the captains of Gondor, whose presence sends a chill through even the bravest warriors on the walls. A commander, a strategist, a shadow in the armies of Mordor whose cunning rivals his cruelty. His name is Gothmog. You will not find ballads sung of him in the halls of Rohan. You will not find his deeds chronicled in lengthy passages of the Lord of the Rings. He appears suddenly, like smoke coalescing into form, and vanishes just as abruptly, leaving behind only devastation and questions. Yet his impact on the War of the Ring is undeniable. He commands the assault on the greatest city of men. He orchestrates the siege that nearly breaks the Free Peoples. He is the mind behind the darkness at the gates. But who is he? Stand on the walls of Minas Tirith if you dare and watch as the siege unfolds. The outer defenses have fallen. The first circle of the city is breached. Gondorian soldiers fight street by street, tower by tower, dying with swords in hand and defiance on their lips. And through it all, coordinating the chaos with ruthless precision, is Gothmog. He does not charge blindly into battle like the orcs he commands. He does not rely on terror alone like the Nazgul circling overhead. He thinks. He plans. He sees the battlefield as a game of strategy, and he plays it with the cold efficiency of a master. Who taught him this art? Where did he come from? What manner of creature stands at the right hand of the Witch King, directing the fall of kingdoms? Tolkien gives us no answers, only fragments, only shadows. And perhaps that is what makes Gothmog so terrifying, not what we know of him, but what we do not. He is the villain whose face remains hidden, whose origins are shrouded, whose power is implied rather than displayed. He is the shadow that moves through the margins of the text, felt but never fully seen. The scholars have debated for decades. The lore masters have pored over every mention of his name, every hint in the appendices, every clue hidden in Tolkien's letters and unfinished drafts. Some say he was a Balrog, a creature of fire and shadow, a lieutenant of Morgoth reborn in the service of Sauron. Others insist he was an orc, perhaps an Uruk-hai of exceptional cunning and strength, elevated to command through sheer brutality and brilliance. Still others whisper darker theories, that he was something unique, something corrupted beyond recognition, a being whose nature defies easy categorization. But the truth, if there is a truth, remains elusive. And that elusiveness is part of his legend. Picture him now as the siege reaches its climax. The gates of Minas Tirith have fallen. The Witch King himself rides through the shattered entrance, his presence a wave of despair that breaks the will of mortal men. But it is Gothmog who ensures the assault does not falter, who commands the reserves, who sends fresh waves of orcs and trolls surging through the breach. He does not need a crown or a blade of terror. His authority is absolute. His voice cuts through the chaos like a blade through flesh. And the armies of Mordor obey. The defenders of Gondor know his name. They have seen his strategies unfold, watched as their carefully laid defenses are dismantled piece by piece. They have felt the weight of his presence, the sense that they are not fighting a mindless horde but a directed force, a weapon wielded with precision. And they know, deep in their hearts, that if the Rohirrim do not arrive soon, if the dawn does not bring hope, then Gothmog will stand victorious in the ruins of their city, and Middle-earth will fall into shadow. But even as the battle rages, even as the fate of the world hangs in the balance, Gothmog himself remains a mystery. We see his actions, but not his face. We hear his commands, but not his thoughts. We feel his impact, but not his origin. He is the enigma at the heart of the siege, the shadow whose true nature is never revealed. And when the battle ends, when the Rohirrim charge across the fields and the tide begins to turn, Gothmog vanishes from the records as suddenly as he appeared. No death scene, no final confrontation, no clear fate. He is there, and then he is not. And in his absence, only questions remain. Who was Gothmog? What was his origin? What powers did he possess? And why did Tolkien leave him so deliberately undefined, a figure of terror and authority whose identity is lost to shadow? The search for answers begins not with certainty, but with fragments, pieces of text, hints in the margins, and the understanding that some mysteries are meant to endure. To speak of Gothmog is to speak in whispers and shadows. He is not a character who dominates the page, whose deeds are chronicled in lengthy chapters, or whose history is detailed in the appendices. He appears in a handful of passages, mentioned almost in passing, yet his presence looms larger than the brevity of his textual appearances would suggest. To understand him, we must piece together fragments, scattered references, linguistic clues, and the silent spaces where Tolkien chose not to elaborate. The primary source is The Return of the King, the third volume of The Lord of the Rings. There, in the chaos of the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, Gothmog is named as the Lieutenant of Morgul, a title that places him second in command to the Witch King himself. He is described as orchestrating the assault on Minas Tirith, directing the siege engines, commanding the reserves, ensuring that the momentum of the attack does not falter even in the face of Gondorian resistance. His role is that of a military commander, a strategist whose presence shapes the course of the battle. But that is all. No physical description, no backstory, no indication of his species, his origin, or the nature of his power. He is simply there, a name, a title, a function within the machinery of Mordor's war. The appendices offer little more. They confirm his role at the siege, mention his coordination with the Witch King, and note that he commanded forces in the aftermath of the initial breach. But they do not expand upon his identity. They do not explain who he was or where he came from. It is as though Tolkien deliberately left him undefined, a blank space in the narrative waiting to be filled by imagination or interpretation. Scholars have turned to the Silmarillion for clues. There, we encounter another Gothmog, a Balrog, the Lord of Balrogs, who served Morgoth in the First Age and led his armies in the wars against the elves. This ancient Gothmog was a creature of immense power, a being of fire and shadow who slew Feanor, the greatest of the Noldor, and who fell only after centuries of terror and destruction. Could the Gothmog of the Third Age be a descendant? a reincarnation, a deliberate echo of that ancient evil. The possibility is tantalizing, but unconfirmed. Tolkien's notes and letters do not clarify the connection. Some scholars argue that the reuse of the name is intentional, a signal that this lieutenant of Morgul carries the legacy of the ancient Balrog, whether literally or symbolically. Others contend that it is merely a coincidence, or perhaps a thematic echo meant to evoke the horrors of the Elder Days without implying a direct lineage. Linguistic analysis offers further intrigue. The name Gothmog has been interpreted in various ways. Some translations suggest Lord of Death or Dread Commander, titles that fit both the ancient Balrog and the Lieutenant of the Third Age. Others note that the structure of the name is consistent with the Black Speech of Mordor, hinting that this Gothmog may have been an orc or some other servant of Sauron, elevated to high rank through skill and ruthlessness. Yet even this is speculation. Tolkien's constructed languages are rich with layered meanings, and the true etymology of Gothmog may be lost to the same shadows that obscure the character himself. What remains, then, are questions. Was Gothmog a Balrog, awakened from some deep slumber to serve Sauron as his ancestors served Morgoth? Was he an orc, perhaps an Uruk-hai bred for command and cunning, whose strategic brilliance set him apart from his savage kin? Or was he something else entirely? A corrupted Maya, a twisted spirit given form, a shadow of Sauron's will made manifest on the battlefield? The texts do not say, and perhaps that is the point. Tolkien was a master of the unspoken, of the shadows that linger at the edges of the story. He understood that not every villain needs a detailed biography, that sometimes the most effective horrors are those left partially undefined. Gothmog is terrifying not because we know too much about him, but because we know too little. He is the unknown commander, the shadow whose true nature is never revealed, the enigma that haunts the margins of the War of the Ring. And so we are left with fragments, a name, a title, a few scattered actions, and the understanding that whatever Gothmog was, he was dangerous enough to stand beside the Witch King, skilled enough to command the siege of the greatest city of men, and mysterious enough that Tolkien chose not to explain him. The lore is incomplete. The records are fragmentary. But in those fragments, a legend endures, a legend of a shadow at the gates, a commander whose identity is lost to time, and a mystery that has captivated scholars and readers for generations. And the mystery, as we shall see, runs deeper still. To understand the danger of Gothmog, we must examine what he accomplished, not through grand displays of sorcery, not through terror incarnate like the Nazgul, but through something far more insidious, calculated, ruthless military genius. In the hours when Minas Tirith stood on the brink of annihilation, when the fate of Middle-earth hung by a thread, it was Gothmog who held that thread, and he knew precisely when to pull. The siege begins at dusk. The armies of Mordor spread across the Pelennor fields like a black tide, tens of thousands strong, orcs and trolls and men of the east and south, all converging on the White City. The defenders watch from the walls, their hearts heavy with dread, knowing that they are outnumbered, outmatched, and that help is days away if it comes at all. The first assault is brutal but predictable. Siege towers roll forward. Battering rams pound the gates. Arrows darken the sky. Gondorian soldiers fight valiantly, but they are holding back the inevitable, not defeating it. And then Grond arrives. The great ram, forged in the fires of Mordor, shaped like the head of a ravening wolf, carried by mountain trolls and blessed with dark sorcery. Its blows shake the very foundations of the city. Once, twice, 3 times, the gates, which have stood for 1,000 years, begin to crack. The defenders redouble their efforts, pouring fire and stone and arrows onto the attackers, but Gothmog has already accounted for this. He sends waves of orcs forward, not to breach the gates, but to draw fire, to exhaust the defenders, to make them spend their arrows and their strength on targets that matter less. It is a tactic of attrition. Cold, calculated, effective. When the gates finally shatter, when the Witch King rides through the breach and the defenders falter in despair, it is Gothmog who ensures the assault does not dissolve into chaos. Orc armies, left to their own devices, are savage but disorganized. They kill with fervor but without coordination. They surge and retreat, driven by bloodlust rather than strategy. But under Gothmog's command, they move with purpose. He directs them to key positions, securing the gate, preventing counterattacks, establishing footholds in the lower levels of the city. He coordinates with the siege engines, ensuring that the bombardment continues, that the defenders have no respite, no chance to regroup. He is everywhere and nowhere. Reports from Gondorian survivors describe a figure moving through the chaos, issuing commands in a voice that cuts through the din of battle. Some say he rode a fell beast, directing the assault from above. Others claim he walked among the orcs, towering over them, his presence alone enough to drive them forward. Still others insist he remained in the shadows, unseen but felt, a dark intelligence orchestrating the destruction from behind the lines. Whatever the truth, the result is undeniable. The outer defenses fall. The first circle of the city is breached. Gondorian soldiers retreat to the second level, then the third, fighting street by street, buying time with their lives. And through it all, Gothmog presses forward, never allowing the momentum to falter, never giving the defenders a moment to breathe. He targets key positions with precision. The commanders, the gates between levels, the supply depots. He does not waste troops on meaningless skirmishes. Every assault has a purpose. Every maneuver is designed to weaken Gondor's ability to resist. He fights not with passion, but with cold, methodical efficiency, the hallmark of a master tactician. And then, in the darkest hour, when the city seems on the verge of total collapse, Gothmog does something unexpected. He holds back reserves. While the Witch King leads the vanguard deeper into Minas Tirith, Gothmog keeps entire battalions in position outside the walls, ready to respond to any counterattack, ready to exploit any weakness that emerges. It is a decision that reveals his strategic depth. He is not simply focused on breaking into the city, but on holding it once taken, on ensuring that Gondor cannot rally or escape. This is the mark of a true commander. Lesser villains would have thrown everything into the assault, seeking glory and destruction without thought for what comes after. But Gothmog understands war in its totality. He knows that breaking an army is not enough. You must shatter its will to resist, cut off its hope of reinforcement, ensure that defeat is absolute and irreversible. The defenders of Gondor recognize this. In the brief moments of respite, huddled behind barricades, tending to the wounded, preparing for the next assault, they speak his name with a mixture of fear and grudging respect. They have faced orc chieftains before, brutes who roar and charge and die easily once their fury is spent. But Gothmog is different. He does not roar. He does not charge recklessly. He watches. He waits. He strikes when the moment is right, and his blows are devastating. There are whispers among the soldiers, dark speculation born of desperation and dread. Some say he is a Balrog, a creature of the ancient world awakened to serve Sauron as his kind once served Morgoth. They claim they have seen flames flickering in his shadow, heard the rumble of his voice like the growl of deep earth. Others dismiss this as the product of fear-addled minds, insisting he is merely a powerful orc, perhaps one of the Uruk-hai bred in Isengard or Mordor, elevated to command through ruthlessness and skill. But no one knows for certain, and that uncertainty becomes its own weapon. The soldiers do not know what they are fighting. They do not know if blades will harm him, if arrows will pierce him, if fire or water or any mortal means can bring him down. And so the fear grows, spreading through the ranks like a plague, sapping the will to resist. By the time the sun sets on the first day of the siege, Minas Tirith is on the verge of falling. The Witch King has entered the city. The Gondorian forces are scattered and broken. The remaining defenders prepare for a last stand, knowing that dawn will bring either salvation or annihilation. And in the shadow of the broken gates, Gothmog stands, silent, watchful, victorious. He has done what Sauron demanded of him. He has brought the White City to its knees. He has proven himself worthy of his title as Lieutenant of Morgul. The armies of Mordor await his next command, ready to deliver the final blow. But the tale does not end there. For even as Gothmog consolidates his victory, even as the darkness seems complete, a sound echoes across the Pelennor fields. A sound that chills the blood of every orc and sends a thrill of hope through the hearts of Gondor's defenders. It is the sound of horns. Not the horns of Gondor, but something older, something fiercer. The horns of Rohan. And with them comes the thunder of 10,000 hooves, the roar of battle fury, and the dawn of a new hope. Gothmog's moment of triumph is about to be tested. And in the chaos that follows, his fate, like his identity, will slip into shadow. The question haunts every scholar who has studied the siege of Minas Tirith. What was Gothmog? Tolkien, with characteristic inscrutability, provides no answer. He gives us a name, a title, and a series of actions, but no description of the being who bears them. And so we are left to speculate, to sift through the fragments of lore, to examine every clue and consider every possibility. The result is not a single theory, but a tapestry of interpretations, each with its own evidence, each with its own appeal. The most dramatic theory is that Gothmog was a Balrog, a demon of flame and shadow, one of the Maiar corrupted by Morgoth in the ancient days and bound to his service. This interpretation draws its strength from the Silmarillion, where we meet the original Gothmog, Lord of Balrogs, commander of Morgoth's armies in the wars of the First Age. That ancient Gothmog was a figure of immense power and terror, responsible for the deaths of great lords and warriors, a being whose very presence on the battlefield could turn the tide of war. Could the Gothmog of the Third Age be the same, or a successor? The texts do not say. The original Gothmog was slain in the fall of Gondolin, his death recorded in the annals of the Eldar. But Tolkien's mythology is full of beings who endure beyond death, spirits who linger, shadows that refuse to fade, malice that takes new form. If any Balrog could have survived or been reborn, it would be one who held the title of Lord, one whose name itself carried weight and power. The evidence, however, is circumstantial. Tolkien does not describe flames or shadows surrounding this Gothmog. He does not speak of whips of fire or wings of darkness. The Lieutenant of Morgul commands armies, issues orders, directs strategy. All actions that could be performed by many kinds of beings, not just Balrogs. And pragmatically, the presence of a Balrog at the siege would have been remarked upon, would have been a centerpiece of the narrative rather than a detail mentioned almost in passing. Still, the connection is tantalizing. The name is the same. The role, commanding the armies of darkness, is parallel. And the absence of physical description could itself be deliberate, a way of leaving the possibility open without committing to it. The second major theory is that Gothmog was an orc, specifically, a high-ranking Uruk-hai or perhaps a unique breed of orc created for command. This interpretation fits the practical details of the siege. Orcs are the backbone of Mordor's armies. They are numerous, expendable, and capable of great cruelty and violence, but they are also capable of cunning. The Uruk-hai of Isengard demonstrated intelligence, discipline, and strategic thinking. It is not implausible that Sauron, with his mastery of breeding and corruption, could have created or elevated an orc of exceptional ability to serve as a field commander. In this reading, Gothmog is terrifying not because he is supernatural, but because he represents the pinnacle of orc kind, a creature who combines the savagery of his race with the intelligence and strategic acumen of a great general. He is proof that the servants of Mordor are not merely mindless hordes, but a hierarchical, organized force capable of sophisticated military operations. The linguistic evidence supports this. Gothmog follows patterns consistent with the Black speech, the language of Mordor. If the name was chosen or given by Sauron, it would make sense for it to reflect orcish linguistic structures. And the title Lieutenant of Morgul suggests a rank within a military hierarchy, a role that could easily be filled by a powerful orc elevated above his peers. But there are problems with this theory as well. Orcs, even the greatest of them, are described as fearful of light, uncomfortable in the open, prone to infighting and disorder. Gothmog displays none of these weaknesses. He commands with authority that is absolute and unquestioned. He coordinates complex maneuvers across a sprawling battlefield. He makes decisions with a clarity and foresight that seem beyond the reach of even the most intelligent orc. Which brings us to the third possibility, that Gothmog was something else entirely. A corrupted man, perhaps, elevated to dark power through service to Sauron. Or a lesser Maya, a spirit not as mighty as a Balrog but still immensely powerful, given form and purpose in the service of Mordor. Or even a unique creation, something fashioned by Sauron's sorcery, a being that defies easy categorization. Part spirit, part flesh, wholly devoted to the will of the Dark Lord. This last possibility is the most speculative, but it has a certain appeal. Sauron, after all, was a craftsman as much as a conqueror. He forged the rings of power. He shaped the Nazgul from mortal kings. It is not beyond imagination that he could have created a lieutenant from raw materials, flesh, shadow, malice, and will, bound together into a form that served his purposes perfectly. In this reading, Gothmog is less a being with a history and more a function, a weapon given just enough autonomy to think and command, but ultimately subordinate to Sauron's overarching will. Each theory has its proponents. Each fits some of the evidence, but none can be definitively proven. Tolkien's silence is absolute. Whether by design or oversight, he left Gothmog undefined, a shadow whose substance remains a mystery. And perhaps that is the true answer. Perhaps Gothmog was meant to be undefined, a name without a face, a presence without a form. A terror that derives its power not from what it is, but from what it might be. In a narrative filled with detailed histories and carefully constructed lineages, Gothmog stands apart, a deliberate gap, a blank space where imagination and fear can flourish. He is the unknown commander, the shadow at the gates, the villain whose true nature is never revealed. And in that unknowing, he becomes something more than any single identity could provide, a symbol of the faceless horror of war, the dread of the unseen enemy, the terror of the shadow that moves just beyond the edge of vision. But if we cannot know what he was, we can still trace what he did. And in his deeds, his danger becomes unmistakable. War is not merely violence. It is geometry, timing, psychology. The great commanders of history understand this. They see the battlefield not as chaos, but as a tapestry of forces in motion, threads that can be pulled, patterns that can be exploited. And Gothmog, whatever his nature, was a master of this dark art. The siege of Minas Tirith is a case study in strategic brilliance. From the initial deployment of forces to the final assault, Gothmog's hand is evident in every phase of the operation. He does not rely on overwhelming force alone, though Mordor's armies number in the tens of thousands. He does not trust to terror, though the presence of the Nazgul and the shadow of Sauron weigh heavily on the defenders. Instead, he orchestrates a campaign of layered pressure, designed to break Gondor's resistance piece by piece. The first phase is encirclement. Before the main assault begins, Gothmog ensures that Minas Tirith is isolated. The outer provinces have been overrun. The roads are cut. No reinforcements can reach the city. No supplies can enter. The defenders are alone, and they know it. This isolation is as much a weapon as any sword or arrow. It breeds despair, saps morale, makes every loss feel permanent and every sacrifice feel futile. The second phase is attrition. Gothmog does not hurl his armies against the walls in a single, desperate charge. Instead, he wears the defenders down. The bombardment from siege engines is relentless, targeting not just the walls but the towers, the gates, the places where defenders gather. Orc archers rain arrows onto the battlements, forcing soldiers to take cover, to expend energy and resources simply staying alive. Small raiding parties probe the defenses, testing for weaknesses, forcing the Gondorians to spread their forces thin, to remain vigilant at all hours. It is exhausting, it is demoralizing, and it is devastatingly effective. By the time the main assault begins, the defenders are already weakened. They have been fighting for days with little rest, little hope, and diminishing supplies. Their numbers have been whittled down by constant skirmishing. Their walls are damaged. Their morale is frayed. And Gothmog knows it. He has measured their strength and found it wanting. Now he moves to exploit that weakness. The assault itself is a masterpiece of coordination. Grond, the great battering ram, is the centerpiece, but it is not the only weapon. Siege towers roll forward on multiple fronts, each one protected by a screen of trolls and orcs, each one positioned to draw defenders away from the main gate. Gothmog understands the principle of misdirection. Make the enemy spread their forces, divide their attention, force them to defend everywhere and therefore defend nowhere effectively. When the gate finally breaks, the breakthrough is not chaotic. Orc hordes do not simply pour through in a mindless rush. Instead, they advance in waves, each wave with a purpose. The first wave secures the breach, establishes a foothold, prevents the defenders from sealing the gap. The second wave pushes deeper, targeting command posts, supply depots, the key infrastructure that allows Gondor to mount a coordinated defense. The third wave spreads out, occupying territory, ensuring that the defenders cannot regroup or counterattack. It is textbook military doctrine. Control the breach, expand the perimeter, consolidate gains, and Gothmog executes it with ruthless precision. But his genius extends beyond tactics. He understands the psychology of warfare. He knows that breaking an army's will is as important as breaking its lines. And so he targets not just soldiers, but symbols. The Great Gates, Gondor's pride and defenses for a millennium, are shattered publicly, spectacularly, with the Witch King himself riding through the rubble. The effect on morale is immediate and catastrophic. Soldiers who might have fought to the last man in defense of an intact city begin to waver when they see their greatest stronghold broken. Gothmog also coordinates with the Nazgul in a way that suggests deep familiarity with their strengths and limitations. The Ringwraiths are weapons of terror, not strategy. They break the will of mortal men, but they do not plan sieges or command armies. That is Gothmog's role. He uses them as shock troops, as instruments of psychological warfare, but he does not rely on them for tactical decisions. When the Witch King confronts Gandalf at the gates, it is a moment of high drama, but the real work of conquest, the coordination of forces, the exploitation of breakthroughs, the prevention of counterattacks, is happening elsewhere under Gothmog's direction. And then there is the matter of the reserves. This, more than anything, reveals the depth of Gothmog's strategic thinking. Even as the city falls, even as victory seems assured, he holds back significant forces. He does not commit everything to the assault. He maintains a reserve outside the walls, positioned to respond to any unexpected threat, to exploit any opportunity, to ensure that the victory is not just won but secured. It is this decision, this restraint, that marks him as exceptional. Lesser commanders would have thrown everything into the attack, seeking total annihilation in a single overwhelming surge. But Gothmog understands that battles are not won in moments, but over time, that reserves give flexibility, that an enemy is not truly defeated until they have no options left. And when the horns of Rohan sound across the Pelennor fields, when 6,000 riders come thundering out of the dawn, Gothmog is ready. He does not panic. He does not lose control of his forces. He redirects the reserves, positions his troops to meet the new threat, and continues to coordinate the defense of his hard-won positions within the city. He adapts. He responds. He fights on. This is what makes him dangerous, not supernatural power, not overwhelming strength, but intelligence. Flexibility. The ability to see the battlefield as a whole and to make decisions in real time that maximize advantage and minimize risk. He is the Shadow General, the mastermind behind the assault, the reason that Minas Tirith nearly falls. In another world, in another war, Gothmog might have been celebrated as one of the great military minds of the age. But in Middle-earth, his genius serves only darkness. His brilliance is bent to the purpose of conquest and destruction. And his legacy is not glory but terror, the memory of a commander who brought the White City to the brink of annihilation. Yet even in the midst of his triumph, even as his plans unfold with devastating precision, there are hints of something more, something unseen, something deeper. For the question remains, where did this genius come from? What force shaped a mind capable of such strategic mastery? And what, if anything, does Gothmog desire beyond the fulfillment of Sauron's will? The texts do not say. But in the shadows of the siege, in the movements of armies and the fall of cities, a portrait emerges, not of a mindless servant, but of a shadow with purpose, a commander whose brilliance is as terrifying as any sorcery. There is another dimension to Gothmog's danger, one that goes beyond tactics and battlefield command. It is the question of his power, not merely his authority over orcs and trolls, but the nature of the force he wields, the influence he exerts, the capabilities that allow him to function as lieutenant to the Witch King and second in command of Mordor's greatest assault. The texts are silent on this. We see the results of his actions, armies that move with precision, defenses that crumble under coordinated assault, strategies that unfold with devastating effectiveness. But we do not see the mechanisms. We do not know how Gothmog commands. Is it through fear, through respect, through some supernatural compulsion that binds the orcs to his will? Or is it simply the force of personality, a presence so commanding, so absolute, that obedience is automatic? Each possibility opens different avenues of interpretation. If Gothmog commands through fear, then he must be fearsome indeed. Orcs are creatures bred in violence, steeped in cruelty from birth. They do not frighten easily. To terrify them into obedience would require something exceptional, a display of power, a reputation for ruthlessness, perhaps a capacity for violence that exceeds even orcish norms. This would fit the Balrog theory, a being of ancient malice and overwhelming strength, whose very presence radiates danger. But fear alone is a brittle foundation for command. Armies ruled by terror are unstable, prone to collapse when the source of fear is removed or when a greater fear emerges. And Gothmog's forces do not collapse. They maintain cohesion even under pressure, even when the Rohirrim charge, even when the tide of battle turns against them. This suggests something more than mere intimidation. Perhaps, then, Gothmog commands through respect, or at least through recognition of competence. The orcs follow him not because they fear his wrath, but because they trust his judgment. He leads them to victory. He keeps them alive. He does not waste their lives on futile charges or pointless cruelty. In the brutal hierarchy of Mordor, where strength and success are the only currencies that matter, Gothmog's track record would earn him loyalty of a sort. The pragmatic loyalty of soldiers who know that their best chance of survival lies in following a competent commander. This interpretation paints Gothmog in a more complex light. He is not just a tyrant or a monster, but a leader in the truest sense, someone whose authority rests on proven ability. It makes him more dangerous in some ways, because it means his power is earned rather than imposed, rooted in reality rather than illusion. But there is a third possibility, darker and more unsettling. Perhaps Gothmog's command is supernatural, a form of compulsion or domination that operates below the level of conscious thought. Sauron himself wielded such power, bending wills and commanding absolute obedience through the force of his spirit. The Nazgul, to a lesser extent, could break minds and sap courage simply through their presence. If Gothmog was a Maya, even a lesser one, or if he was imbued with some fragment of Sauron's own will, he might possess similar abilities. In this reading, the orcs obey Gothmog not because they choose to, but because they cannot do otherwise. His commands bypass reason and instinct, imposing themselves directly onto their consciousness. It would explain the precision of his control, the seamless coordination of thousands of disparate troops, the absence of the infighting and disorder that plague other orc armies. It would also explain why Gothmog himself remains so enigmatic. If his power is supernatural, then his physical form matters less. He could be anything, as long as the force of his will is strong enough. Beyond command, there is the question of Gothmog's broader influence. He is called the Lieutenant of Morgul, a title that ties him directly to Minas Morgul, the fortress of the Nazgul. This suggests a relationship with the Ringwraiths that goes beyond simple hierarchy. Does he serve them? Does he coordinate with them as equals? Or does he perhaps have authority over them in certain contexts? The texts hint at coordination, but do not clarify the chain of command. The Witch King leads the assault on Minas Tirith, but Gothmog directs the forces. The Nazgul terrorize the defenders, but Gothmog ensures that terror translates into tactical advantage. It is a partnership of sorts, one that suggests mutual recognition of each other's strengths. The Witch King is the symbol, the avatar of dread. Gothmog is the executor, the one who translates dread into conquest. But this raises further questions. If Gothmog is powerful enough to coordinate with the Nazgul, if he is trusted enough to command armies in the field without direct oversight from Sauron or Barad-dûr, then he must occupy a position of extraordinary importance in the hierarchy of Mordor. He is not merely a field commander. He is one of the highest-ranking servants of the Dark Lord, a figure whose authority rivals that of the Ringwraiths themselves. And yet, we know almost nothing about him. He has no history recorded in the chronicles, no deeds from the earlier ages, no lineage or origin story. It is as though he appeared fully formed at the siege, a shadow that stepped out of nowhere to command the fall of kingdoms. This absence is itself a kind of power. In a world where lineage and history matter, where the great figures of legend carry the weight of their past deeds and ancestry, Gothmog is unmoored from history. He is a blank, a void, a presence without context, and that makes him unpredictable. The defenders of Gondor cannot anticipate him because they do not know him. The scholars cannot categorize him because he defies categories. Perhaps that is the ultimate source of his danger, not strength, not magic, but the simple, terrifying fact that he cannot be known. He is the shadow that moves without explanation, the force that acts without precedent, the enigma that defeats understanding. And in the chaos of war, when survival depends on anticipating the enemy, facing an enemy who cannot be anticipated is the most dangerous thing of all. But even shadows have limits. Even enigmas can be broken. And when the Rohirrim charge, when the tide turns and the armies of Mordor begin to falter, the question becomes, what happens to Gothmog? Does he fall? Does he flee? Or does he vanish as mysteriously as he appeared, leaving only questions in his wake? The horns of Rohan shatter the dawn. 6,000 riders, led by King Theoden, come thundering across the Pelennor fields with a fury born of desperation and hope. The sound of their charge is like the breaking of a great wave, and before it, the armies of Mordor falter. Orcs scatter. Trolls turn to face the new threat. And for the first time since the siege began, the defenders of Minas Tirith dare to believe that they might survive. But Gothmog does not falter. Even as the Rohirrim smash into the rear of Mordor's forces, even as the battlefield descends into chaos, the Lieutenant of Morgul maintains control. He redirects reserves. He repositions his troops. He coordinates a defense against the cavalry charge with the same cold precision he brought to the assault on the city. The orcs, who might have broken and fled under lesser command, hold their ground. They form ranks. They meet the Rohirrim with spears and shields and the desperate ferocity of trapped animals. The battle becomes a maelstrom. Horses and riders clash with orcs and trolls. Swords ring against armor. The wounded scream. The dying fall in heaps. And through it all, somewhere in the chaos, Gothmog moves, coordinating, commanding, ensuring that Mordor's forces do not collapse entirely. But the momentum has shifted. The Rohirrim are fresh, their spirit unbroken, their charge devastating. The orcs, exhausted from days of siege and assault, begin to give ground. Slowly at first, then faster. The retreat is not quite a rout, not yet, but it is undeniable. Minas Tirith will not fall today. And then the Witch King himself enters the fray. He descends upon Theoden like a shadow of death, and the King of Rohan falls beneath the terror of the Nazgul Lord. For a moment, it seems the tide might turn again, but Eowyn and Merry stand against him. The Witch King is destroyed. The greatest of the Nazgul is unmade, his shriek echoing across the fields as his spirit is torn from the world. And in that moment, Mordor's assault breaks. The orcs who held their ground under Gothmog's command now lose cohesion. The death of the Witch King is a blow they cannot absorb. He was their greatest weapon, the avatar of their master's power, and now he is gone. Panic spreads. Units break formation. Orcs flee toward the river or back toward the gates of Mordor, abandoning their positions, their weapons, their purpose. But what of Gothmog? The texts are silent. Tolkien does not record his death. He does not describe a final confrontation, a heroic duel, a climactic moment where the Lieutenant of Morgul falls to sword or spear. Gothmog simply vanishes from the narrative. One moment he is coordinating the siege, and the next he is gone, his fate unrecorded, his end a mystery. Some scholars argue that he must have died in the chaos of the battle. The Pelennor Fields became a slaughterhouse, and few of Mordor's commanders survived. It is easy to imagine Gothmog falling to a Rohirric lance, or trampled beneath the hooves of horses, or cut down in the confusion as the armies of Gondor and Rohan swept through the orc ranks. His death might have gone unnoticed simply because there was too much else happening, too many other battles being fought, too many other stories unfolding. Others point out that Tolkien was meticulous about recording the deaths of significant characters. When great figures fall, Theoden, the Witch King, even lesser captains and heroes, their deaths are noted, given weight, marked as important moments in the narrative. The fact that Gothmog's death is not recorded suggests that perhaps he did not die. Perhaps he escaped. This possibility is tantalizing. If Gothmog survived the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, what became of him? Did he flee back to Mordor to report his failure to Sauron? Did he regroup with the scattered remnants of the orc armies, attempting to mount some new assault? Or did he vanish into the shadows, a rogue element, a shadow without a master now that Sauron's power was waning? The implications are unsettling. If Gothmog lived, if he retained his intelligence and his strategic genius, he could have posed a continuing threat, a commander capable of organizing the scattered forces of evil, of launching raids and ambushes, of becoming a lingering shadow even after the War of the Ring ended. But there is no evidence of this. After the Pelennor Fields, Gothmog is never mentioned again. He does not appear at the Black Gate. He does not lead any subsequent assaults. He is simply absent, as though he stepped out of the narrative and into oblivion. This absence has fueled speculation. Some believe that Gothmog was so closely tied to the Witch King that the Nazgul's destruction unmade him as well, that he was a creation or extension of the Ringwraith's power, and when the Witch King fell, Gothmog dissolved like smoke. Others suggest that Sauron, enraged by the failure at Minas Tirith, destroyed Gothmog himself, punishing his lieutenant for allowing the siege to fail. Still others take a darker view. They suggest that Gothmog's disappearance was deliberate, that he recognized the inevitability of Mordor's defeat and chose to vanish, to hide, to preserve himself for some future opportunity. In this reading, he becomes something more than a mere lieutenant, a survivor, a schemer, a shadow that endures beyond the fall of its master. The truth, as with so much about Gothmog, is unknowable. Tolkien left no notes, no drafts, no clarifications. Whether by design or oversight, the fate of the Lieutenant of Morgul remains as mysterious as his origin. But mysteries have a way of taking on a life of their own. In the absence of facts, legend grows. And the legend of Gothmog, the Shadow Commander, the enigmatic general, the lieutenant whose identity and fate are lost to time, has endured far beyond the pages of The Lord of the Rings. In the centuries after the War of the Ring, travelers in the ruins of Mordor report strange sightings, shadows that move with purpose, voices in the darkness that issue commands in the black speech, orcish war bands that display unusual discipline, as though led by someone who knows the arts of war. Are these merely the remnants of Sauron's forces, leaderless and desperate? Or is something else at work, a presence that survived, a commander who still walks the broken lands? The tales are fragmentary, unverifiable, the stuff of rumor and fear. But they persist. And in their persistence, they keep alive the question that has haunted readers and scholars for generations. What happened to Gothmog? Did he die on the Pelennor fields, his body lost among the thousands? Did he flee to vanish into the wilds of Middle-earth? Or did he become something else? A shadow unbound, a will without a master, a lingering echo of Mordor's malice? We do not know. We may never know. But the absence of an answer is, in its own way, the most fitting conclusion to his story. For Gothmog was always a shadow, always an enigma, always a presence felt but never fully seen. And shadows, once cast, are not so easily dispelled. To understand Gothmog's place in the legendarium, we must situate him within the broader hierarchy of evil that Tolkien so carefully constructed. Middle-earth is not a world of simple binaries, where darkness is a monolithic force and all villains are interchangeable. It is a world of layers, of degrees of malice, of figures whose power and purpose vary enormously. And within that hierarchy, Gothmog occupies a unique and troubling position. At the apex stands Sauron himself, the Dark Lord, the master of Mordor, the architect of the War of the Ring. Sauron is a Maya, a being of immense spiritual and physical power, whose corruption runs so deep that he has become synonymous with evil itself. He is not merely a villain but a force of nature, a will so vast that it shapes the world around it. His presence is felt across Middle-earth, even when he does not act directly. He is the center, the source, the mind behind the shadow. Beneath Sauron are the Nazgul, the Ringwraiths, mortal kings corrupted by the 9 rings and transformed into undying servants of the Dark Lord. The Nazgul are weapons of terror. They do not think independently, do not strategize or plan. They are extensions of Sauron's will, bound to him absolutely, incapable of disobedience. Their power is immense. They break the courage of mortal men, they command dread beasts, they wield blades of sorcery. But they are not commanders in the strategic sense. They are hammers, not scalpels. And then there is Gothmog. He is called the Lieutenant of Morgul, which places him in association with the Nazgul, but his role is fundamentally different. He does not terrify. He does not break wills through supernatural dread. He commands. He plans. He coordinates. He thinks. In the hierarchy of Mordor, he occupies a space that the Nazgul cannot fill, the space of the strategist, the battlefield general, the executor of complex military operations. This makes him, in some ways, more dangerous than the Ringwraiths. The Nazgul are terrifying, but their terror is blunt. It can be resisted by the strong-willed, mitigated by courage or the light of day. Gothmog's danger is subtler and more pervasive. He does not need to break your spirit. He will simply outmaneuver you, outthink you, exploit your weaknesses until your defenses collapse. Compare him to other lieutenants and captains of Mordor. The mouth of Sauron, who appears at the Black Gate, is a diplomat and a messenger, a servant of words rather than swords. The various orc chieftains who lead smaller forces are brutal and effective in their way, but they lack Gothmog's scope of vision, his ability to coordinate large-scale operations. Even the great trolls and beasts of war, for all their strength, are mindless tools compared to the intelligence that Gothmog displays. Within the structure of Tolkien's evil, Gothmog represents something specific, the danger of competent malice. Not the overwhelming supernatural terror of Sauron, not the dread of the Nazgul, but the cold, calculated effectiveness of a mind that understands war and wages it without mercy or hesitation. He is the villain who does not monologue, does not gloat, does not waste time on cruelty for its own sake. He simply wins. And this raises a fascinating question. Why is Gothmog so effective when so many other servants of Sauron are not? The Dark Lord's forces are vast, but they are also chaotic. Orcs fight among themselves. Trolls are difficult to control. The armies of men who serve Mordor do so out of fear or corruption, and their loyalty is fragile. Yet Gothmog forges these disparate elements into a cohesive fighting force. How? One possibility is that Sauron recognized the need for such a figure and deliberately created or elevated Gothmog to fill that role. If the Dark Lord could corrupt kings into Nazgul, could he not also shape a servant specifically designed for command? A being whose intelligence and will were calibrated to serve as the operational mind of his armies. Another possibility is that Gothmog represents a remnant of an older age, a survivor from the wars of the First or Second Ages, whose experience and knowledge make him uniquely suited to his role. If he is indeed connected to the Balrog Gothmog of the Silmarillion, whether as the same being reborn or as a successor, then he carries with him the tactical wisdom of millennia, lessons learned in battles against the greatest warriors and strategists of the elder days. But regardless of his origin, what is clear is that Gothmog occupies a niche in Tolkien's mythology that is both specific and essential. He is the Shadow General, the mind behind the assault, the executor of Sauron's will in the theater of war. He is not the most powerful villain, not the most terrifying, not the most dramatic. But he is, in his own way, one of the most dangerous, because he represents the mundane horror of effective evil, the realization that malice combined with intelligence is more dangerous than malice alone. And this is what makes him so compelling as a character, despite his minimal presence in the texts. He is not a monster to be feared or a dark lord to be opposed. He is a problem to be solved, an enemy who must be outmaneuvered rather than simply defeated in combat. He challenges the heroes not on the level of myth or prophecy, but on the level of strategy and tactics, the level where wars are actually won and lost. In the broader tapestry of Tolkien's villains, Gothmog stands out precisely because he is understated. He does not have the grand speeches of Saruman, the mythic terror of the Balrog, the tragic corruption of Gollum, or the overwhelming presence of Sauron. He is, in narrative terms, a minor figure, a name mentioned in passing, a role filled but not explored. Yet his impact on the War of the Ring is undeniable. The Siege of Minas Tirith is the climactic battle of the Third Age, the moment when the fate of Middle-earth hangs in the balance. And it is Gothmog who brings that city to the brink of destruction. It is his strategy, his coordination, his relentless pressure that nearly breaks the Free Peoples. Without him, the siege might have failed. The orcs might have attacked in disorganized waves, easily repelled. The momentum might have been lost. Gondor might have held. But with Gothmog directing the assault, the outcome is in doubt until the very last moment, until the arrival of the Rohirrim tips the balance. He is the shadow that makes the light seem brighter by contrast, the competent evil that makes heroism necessary, the enigma that, in remaining unexplained, becomes a lasting part of the legend. And in the hierarchy of Tolkien's villains, that is a distinction all its own. The published texts tell us what Gothmog did, but they leave vast spaces of silence, spaces that have been filled over the decades with speculation, theory, and the creations of imagination. In the absence of definitive answers, a folklore has grown around the Lieutenant of Morgul, tales that exist in the margins of Tolkien's world, built from hints and possibilities. Some of these speculations focus on his interactions with other figures of power. Was there a moment, unrecorded in the chronicles, when Gothmog stood before Sauron in the Dark Tower? What would such a meeting have looked like? The Dark Lord, terrible and vast, seated upon his throne of shadow, and Gothmog, whether Balrog, orc, or something else, reporting on the progress of the siege, receiving commands, perhaps even offering counsel. It is an image that fascinates because it suggests a relationship beyond simple master and servant, a recognition, perhaps, that Sauron valued Gothmog's strategic mind enough to listen. Others wonder about his relationship with the Nazgul. The Witch King is described as the greatest of Sauron's servants, the most terrible of the Ringwraiths. Yet it is Gothmog who holds the title of lieutenant, who coordinates the armies, who makes the tactical decisions. Was there tension between them? Did the Witch King resent having to defer to another's judgment in matters of war? Or was there mutual respect, an understanding that they each had their roles, that terror and strategy were complementary rather than competing? The texts give no answers, but the possibilities are rich. Imagine a scene in the planning of the siege. The Witch King, shrouded in darkness, radiating cold malice, and Gothmog, pragmatic and precise, laying out the assault plan, explaining the timing, the reserves, the contingencies. It would be a meeting of two kinds of power, the supernatural and the tactical, and the tension between them could reveal much about the inner workings of Mordor. There are also theories about Gothmog's potential influence on the broader history of Middle-earth. If he was indeed a Balrog, or connected to the Balrog of the First Age, then his presence in the Third Age raises questions. Were there other Balrogs who survived into the later ages, hidden in deep places, waiting for Sauron's call? Was Gothmog the last of his kind, or one of several? And if he survived the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, could he have influenced events in the Fourth Age, becoming a lingering threat that the chronicles do not record? Some fans have speculated about encounters that Tolkien never wrote, moments where Gothmog's path might have crossed with other major characters. What if Aragorn, in his days as a ranger, had encountered the lieutenant of Morgul on some dark road near the borders of Mordor? What if Gandalf, in his wanderings, had glimpsed Gothmog and recognized in him a danger that the wise had underestimated? These are scenes that exist only in imagination, but they speak to the way Gothmog has captured the fascination of readers. He is a blank canvas, and onto him we project possibilities. There is also the question of his legacy among the orcs themselves. After the fall of Sauron, after the armies of Mordor were broken and scattered, did the survivors remember Gothmog? Did they tell stories of him in their caves and hideouts, tales of the great commander who nearly brought down Minas Tirith? In orcish culture, such as it is, would he be remembered as a hero, a figure to be emulated? Or as a failure, a commander who could not secure victory despite his brilliance? The idea of Gothmog becoming a legend among orcs is particularly haunting. Imagine, generations later, orcish warbands invoking his name, trying to replicate his strategies, holding him up as an ideal of what an orc commander should be. It would give him a kind of immortality, not as a living being, but as an idea, a standard, a shadow that continues to shape the culture of Mordor's remnants long after his death. And then there are the darker speculations. Some fans have proposed that Gothmog was more than a lieutenant, that he was, in some sense, a rival to Sauron. Not openly, not in a way that would invite destruction, but subtly in the recesses of his mind. If Gothmog was intelligent enough to command armies, was he intelligent enough to question his master, to harbor ambitions of his own, to imagine a world where he, not Sauron, ruled? This interpretation is speculative in the extreme, unsupported by any textual evidence. But it is compelling because it adds another layer to the mystery. It transforms Gothmog from a loyal servant into a potential schemer, a figure with his own agenda hidden beneath the surface. And if that agenda existed, what became of it after Sauron's fall? Did it die with him? Or did it survive, a seed waiting for the right conditions to grow? These tales and theories, these speculative legacies, are not canon. They exist in the space between what Tolkien wrote and what readers have imagined. But they are part of Gothmog's enduring appeal. He is a character defined by absence, and into that absence, we pour our questions, our fears, our fascination with the unknown. He is the villain we never fully meet, the strategist whose plans we see but whose thoughts remain hidden, the shadow whose true form is never revealed. And in remaining undefined, he becomes infinite, a figure who can be anything, who can inspire endless speculation, who can haunt the imagination in ways that a fully explained character never could. The legend of Gothmog, in the end, is not what Tolkien wrote. It is what he did not write, and what in that silence continues to grow. There is a power in the unspoken, in the question left unanswered, in the figure who appears, shapes events, and vanishes before their story is fully told. Tolkien understood this deeply. His world is vast, his histories sprawling, and yet he knew that not everything needed to be explained. Some mysteries are more potent when they remain mysteries. Some shadows are darker when their source is never revealed. Gothmog is one such shadow. He appears in the narrative of The Lord of the Rings for only a brief moment, a handful of references, a few actions, a name that carries weight but no history. Yet his presence looms larger than those scant mentions would suggest. He is the lieutenant of Morgul, the commander who nearly brought down the greatest city of men, the strategist whose brilliance rivaled the heroes who opposed him. He is a figure of danger, of competence, of terrifying effectiveness. But more than that, he is an enigma. And it is that enigma, the uncertainty of his nature, the absence of his backstory, the mystery of his fate, that has made him one of the most enduring figures in Tolkien's legendarium. Not the most famous, not the most powerful, not the most dramatic, but one of the most haunting. Consider what we do not know. We do not know what Gothmog was, Balrog, Orc, corrupted Maya, something else entirely. We do not know where he came from, whether he was an ancient being awakened or a recent creation of Sauron's will. We do not know how he commanded, whether through fear, respect, or supernatural compulsion. And we do not know what happened to him after the Pelennor Fields, whether he died in the chaos of battle, fled into the shadows, or was unmade by forces beyond mortal understanding. These are not gaps in the narrative. They are deliberate spaces, choices that Tolkien made, consciously or unconsciously, to leave certain elements undefined. And in those spaces, our imaginations take root. Gothmog becomes whatever we need him to be. For some, he is the last echo of the ancient Balrogs, a creature of fire and terror barely constrained by mortal form. For others, he is the ultimate orc, proof that even the most despised and underestimated of Sauron's servants could rise to greatness through cunning and will. For still others, he is something unique, a being crafted specifically for the War of the Ring, a shadow given just enough substance to serve as the operational mind of Mordor's assault. Each interpretation is valid. Each is supported by fragments of the text, and each adds to the legend. This is the genius of the unexplained villain. Gothmog does not need a detailed biography to be effective. He does not need a tragic backstory, a complex motivation, or a dramatic death scene. He needs only to act to demonstrate competence, to pose a credible threat, to shape the outcome of the story in meaningful ways. And he does all of this without ever stepping fully into the light. In the broader context of The Lord of the Rings, Gothmog serves a specific narrative function. He is the Shadow General, the embodiment of the mundane horror of war, the realization that evil does not need to be supernatural to be dangerous, that intelligence and ruthlessness are as deadly as any dark magic. He reminds us that the armies of Mordor are not mindless hordes, but organized forces led by minds that understand strategy, that exploit weakness, that wage war with purpose and precision. And in remaining mysterious, he amplifies the horror. The known enemy can be studied, anticipated, countered. But the unknown enemy, the shadow whose nature is unclear, whose capabilities are uncertain, whose motivations are hidden, is infinitely more frightening. Gothmog is the commander you cannot predict, the strategist you cannot outthink, because you do not know enough about him to even begin. This is why his legacy endures. Decades after the publication of The Lord of the Rings, scholars and fans still debate his identity. Theories proliferate. Speculations multiply. He has become a fixture of Tolkien forums, a perennial topic of analysis and discussion. And with each new generation of readers, the mystery is rediscovered, the questions asked anew. What was Gothmog? The answer, in the end, may be less important than the question itself. Because the question keeps us engaged with the text, keeps us thinking about the world Tolkien built, keeps us aware that even in a story as thoroughly chronicled as The Lord of the Rings, there are still shadows, still unknowns, still mysteries waiting to be explored. Gothmog is the shadow at the gates, the lieutenant whose face we never see, the strategist whose mind we never fully understand. He is the name that carries weight without explanation, the presence that shapes events without dominating them, the enigma that refuses resolution. He is, in the truest sense, Tolkien's most dangerous mystery, not because of what he does, but because of what we do not know about him. And in a world as rich and detailed as Middle-earth, that restraint, that willingness to leave something unexplained is a mark of literary mastery. The siege is over. The war is won. The towers of Mordor have fallen, but the shadow of Gothmog lingers, in the ruins of the Pelennor fields, in the darkened halls of Minas Morgul, in the pages of a book where his name appears briefly and then fades into silence. And somewhere in the space between what is written and what is imagined, a figure stands, shrouded, silent, unknowable. The lieutenant, the strategist, the shadow, Gothmog, and the mystery endures. Dear listener, this story ends, but many await. Subscribe so no tale escapes you.